to start today's lesson with a pop quiz. So first thing we're doing is we're going to take a little quiz here. So, simple question. Who is this? You can drop it in the chat if you know who this is. Or you can, I see someone has their hand up. Feel free, shout it out.
This is Dandy.
Who's Dandy?
Dota pro player.
Yeah. So, I like to start here with a room full of Ukrainian educators. This is somebody who probably for many of your students is very well known. In the world, he is a globally known legend in the game Dota 2, and he's from Lviv. And and I think this is kind of just one of those things I like to bring up as an example, because we've got inside kind of the world of video games, people who are quite famous and very well known, but perhaps for us who aren't in video games or don't really pay attention to video games, we may have no idea who these people are. And so it's an interesting component where we don't think of video games as just a software, but we also think of them as a culture and as a discourse and how people communicate. And so that's one of the things that I think is really both challenging about introducing games into the classroom, as well as exciting about bringing games into the classroom, is all of the culture and the discourse and the communication around video games really present where the interesting opportunities are for language and communication. And so it's more than just bringing software into our classroom. I like to make the analogy that in the same way that we would often expect everyone to know who the Beatles are, we don't have that same level of expectation for people who are in video games. And so how do we bridge that gap? And I like to start there, because if we look at video games, and think about them as an industry, it may be a little hard to see here, but to give you some examples and kind of set the framework for this, the theater industry, the performing arts, are about a $9 billion a year industry, US dollars a year. Music, we all listen to music. Everyone enjoys music and listens to a variety of music. I'm sure everyone has used music in their classroom. Music is a $30 billion a year industry. Movies, film, we have probably all used film clips in our classroom. We've probably all used film to teach, or we studied language watching films ourselves. Typically a 40 to maybe $60 billion a year industry, depending on the year. Again, these are established kind of media in our classroom. But if you look at video games are 120, some estimates $150 billion a year, 5 times bigger than the music industry, and they're not well represented in the classroom. The challenge here is really important, and I think that we have to recognize as educators is video games aren't just software, and they're not just entertainment, they're an industry. And that's important for us for 2 reasons, I believe. One is, they're now the 5th major media literacy. We talk about books and music and movies and television. Now we have this 5th media literacy that is very underrepresented in our classroom approaches. So how do we bring it into our classroom more? Because for our students, they'll often be very versed. Research has indicated over 70% of people under the age of 25 play some form of video game weekly, if not daily. But then we have, educators who may not be as integrated into that environment. And so this is, again, important for reasons more than money. We're seeing even the biggest film directors doing things with video games. Joe Russo is the director of the movie Avengers Endgame, with his brother Anthony Russo. The biggest movie of all time, the biggest movie in history, and they're now making movies for the video game Fortnite. That's what they're doing right now. So they're shifting in, and we're seeing people talk about, the next generation of storytelling, the next generation of interactivity is going to be in video games. Many TV shows are now being made with video game technology. We're seeing, the influence of video games on the internet, on, digital storytelling. And so the other component about this I think is really important is this means jobs, especially for our students, who are learning language and studying different languages. If they're going to be in the video game industry, they need English. It's almost, a requirement to be in the video game world is having some level of English. And so as language educators, I think it's even more important that we think about how we can bring video games in the classroom, because games and English equal jobs. For example, Ubisoft is one of the biggest video game publishers in the world, makers of the Assassin's Creed franchise and Rainbow Six Siege and a whole host of other games. If you visit the Ubisoft Kyiv website, they have an office in Kyiv, Ukraine. Almost every job posted requires some level of English. So, if you're going to get a job in Ukraine in video games, you need English, right? And so this idea of, going into this $150 billion a year industry, you're going to need multiple languages to do that. And so this works in kind of two ways. I think as educators, we have to think about that. How do our classes prepare students for these types of jobs? We teach English for business, and we teach English for tourism, and we teach English, for translation. I have yet to see an English for video game purposes class, an English for video games kind of, study pathway at a university. And I think it's warranted. I think now's the time that we can really start to think about that. One of the other things I think is really interesting about video games that is really important for language educators and language learners is the whole area of localization. So there's many companies out there that exist just to make, here's a video game that was made in Canada, and we need to localize it to an audience in Brazil. There's a game made in, the United States that needs to be localized into the Ukrainian language and cultural context, right? And so Bondarenko in 2018 talks about this and said, localization involves a few different things. It involves translation. You're obviously, you're taking the lines spoken in one language and you're translating them into the next language for the appropriate audience. But then you have to edit that language and make sure that it fits. If you're changing from one alphabet to another alphabet, from, the Latin alphabet to Arabic, there's some editing and things have to be done there, making sure that the language fits the motion of the character animations, things like that. You have to proofread all that language. We're often talking 30, 50, sometimes more than 1 million lines of dialogue in some of these games. So vast amounts of language, because unlike a movie where, language, script, the line is really linear, with video games, you never know what the player is going to pick. So you have to have, for each line of dialogue, you might have 3 or 4 options, right? All needs to be proofread. You have to make sure you integrate that. Do comments or do actions in the game make sense culturally? There are gestures, there are actions that happen in one culture that are completely unknown or even unacceptable in another culture. So you have to make those changes as well. And, in that regional adaptation. And then finally, linguistic quality assurance, going through the game and making sure it's linguistically accurate, that everything is structured right, the syntax is correct. And so this is a really big area of video games that our students could be prepared for and that we have to think about. So again, games as jobs is this area that, we should really think about. And so part of that is, one, kind of bringing games into the classroom and using games as a learning and teaching tool. But the second is thinking more about, coursework or classes and opportunities for fields of study that would prepare our students for this type of work. So how do we think along both of those tracks at the same time? Now, for the bulk of this, we're going to talk about, games in the classroom. So we'll get in more into how to make space for games in the sense that what do we do with them and what about our class may need to change in order to have games in our classroom. And the place I really like to start here is this is called the TPAC model. So this is from Mishra and Kohler, and they make this argument that I really like, and they say, look, we have our pedagogy, in our classroom. We know how to teach. We're trained as teachers and we have this skill set, but we also have content. So we've got our subject matter that we're teaching. And, depending on what I'm teaching, my pedagogy may change. But they also make the argument that when we introduce technology into the classroom, our pedagogy must change and our content must change as well. And the successful or unsuccessful implementation of technology into the classroom is really dependent on how much change we make to our pedagogy and how much change we make to our content. And this is often the biggest challenge. When I work with educators in technology, looking at how things are taught or looking at content and saying, well, what can we change here? What are we going to change about the content? And, if we say, well, I can't change the content, I can't do that, our technology integration isn't going to be successful. And video games are really interesting in the one way in that the level of interactivity and the level of player choice in video games really means that we have to seriously think about what in our pedagogy must change in order to make space for video games. Because they're definitely rooted in an active learning approach that we'll get into in a little bit. So first step, thinking about, I want to use video games in my classroom, taking a look at the way we teach and what we teach and trying to understand what changes or adjustments we may need to make in order to use games successfully. Kind of step one. And step two, this is from Moore in 2014, and this is basically a basic technology adoption curve. This idea that Moore puts out that says, if you're going to use technology, there are people who really like to try new things. They're not worried if it's going to fail. They're not worried if it's going to be unsuccessful. They just like to try new things. And there are people at the back end of the curve, kind of the skeptics, who are really slow to accept new things and really slow to try new technology. So ask yourself, where on an adoption curve are you? If you're someone who is a little more conservative with technology or a little more skeptical of using it in the classroom, maybe we want to start small with a game. Maybe just one activity once in the class and see how it goes. But if you're someone who's a little more, early adopter, really likes to try new things, how might an entire unit or how might an entire semester go using a video game in the class? So kind of decide what's right for you. What is it that you want to do, and what are you comfortable with doing? And how, like with the TPAC model, how might your pedagogy and your content need to change? So think about these things is always step one. But I find it's the step that many educators will skip. What game should I use and how should I use it is often the first question I get. And that's a really hard question to answer. There is no one kind of perfect game that works for every class. Instead, we want to think about, what can I do in my teaching context and what am I comfortable with doing in my teaching context? And from there, start to kind of choose the games that work best for us or for our students. And this is really important, that we have to make space for games in our class. Ken Bain has a great book called What Great College Professors Do. And he has this quote, and he says, "The very best teachers offer a balance between the systematic and the messy." And, I really like that because games in our classroom can be messy because what they allow for is student choice. Students are able to kind of take an action and see the results of that action. So you may have students going in very different directions with their learning. And so how do we balance that? Giving students more choice and more flexibility and more freedom in the class alongside the content that we have to teach. We have a syllabi with content that we have to cover. So really when we think about games, it's how do we differentiate our instruction? There's lecture and there's question and answer and there's discussion, but what else can we do? How do we get everybody involved? As a game developer, the concept that I really like is there's a concept of leaning in versus leaning back. And what that really is when I go home at night and I want to relax, if I want to shut my brain off, we tend to lean back. This is what humans do when we relax. But maybe I'm watching a football game and it's starting to get exciting and I start to lean in. When our brains are working, when we're really excited, when we're really engaged, we tend to lean in, we tend to lean forward. When I'm in a conversation with my friends, I'm leaning in, but maybe if I'm listening to a lecture in class, I'm leaning back. So I like to ask teachers, I say, how much leaning back do your students do? And how much leaning in do they do? There's a time for a lecture. There's a time for students to lean back and listen and take notes and be prepared for that standardized test or that final exam. But thinking about video games, that's the time when we want them to lean in, we want them talking, want them engaged, want them trying new things. That's what we're really looking for there. So think about that. When do we want students getting involved, right? And one of the reasons I like to talk about this and bring up that level of activity and engagement is our society has changed, but overall our education hasn't. This is something that media scholars discuss, where school was built in the in the industrial age. Late 1800s, early 1900s, we created the formal school system where the book had information and the teacher had information. So in order to get information, I had to go to class and I had to listen. The desks are in our rows and we sit and we take, our little board and we write notes. But since then we've had computers and now information is cheap. Information is everywhere. So if the purpose of our class is for students to sit and get information, we're sort of out of date in a lot of ways. And media scholars now argue we're in the experience age. Now, Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and Twitter and all these, things that we use, they're designed to show my experiences to the world. I show my experience and you show yours and we interact together. And that's what video games do really well. They provide experience in places where we can't necessarily create an experience like a classroom. And part of this is what, we think about video games and I hear the question, my students love video games. They're so popular. Why? Really kind of it comes down to a core reason. This is something that Jenkins in 2006 talks about of participatory culture. Humans as social creatures, we love few things humans love. We love interacting with people, talking, socializing, and we also love solving problems, right? And that's what video games do really well, those two things. And Jenkins argues that video games and this experience culture are what we call participatory culture. And what participatory culture means is I'm able to quickly engage with a group and get feedback. There are low barriers to engagement. I can just join a game and start playing with a social group of people. There's a strong support for creating material and sharing information with people. People who have more information will share that information with people who have less information, right? And there's a strong social connection. So, when our students love games, it's not really the game that they love, it's the social connection. You might have students who love the game Fortnite. They talk about Fortnite all the time, but you'll see when their friends start to quit playing, they'll quit playing too. It's not the game they're addicted to. We talk about video games being addictive. They're addicted to the interacting with other people and sharing experiences, right? So that's what we really want to think about is, video games as a software. If we think about them as something to teach our student, we're not going to get the results that we want out of them. What we can say is, how does this game create an experience? My students can interact with one another in that experience, and then the language they produce as a part of that experience sharing, that's what I can use in my class, right? That's what I can use to teach them. That's what I can use to get them to use the language of study. So, we can kind of think about that, because what video games really are is this concept called a third place. And I'm sure many people have heard about this concept, but really we have home and we have work. Those are our two main places. But where do you go for that social experience? Where do you go to socialize with people? You may, your third place might be the town square where you go and chat with friends. It might be a club that you join. It might be a place of religion. And for many people, especially during the pandemic that we find ourselves in, these online video game spaces have become these third places. Great example. This is the picture that you see there are my nieces and nephews and I playing a video game together, because we couldn't see one another face to face, so we socialized in a video game. I play Diablo with a friend in Kharkiv in Ukraine. So that's our third place. That's where we go and we spend time together, because I can't see my friend in Kharkiv. So this idea of creating a distance. And again, what's interesting is for many people, the dominant language in this space is English, and so students may play in another language, because they want to socialize with people in that target language. Many educators, they may have learned English listening to music. I learned English memorizing the Beatles, or, I watched the TV show Friends and I learned English. For many students today, they're learning English by playing video games because it's a social space for them. So, we want to think about that. It's a social event. It's a way to create an experience in our classroom. So how do we make time for that active learning? As a person who works in instructional design, I'll sit down with a faculty and we want to, restructure their class and make it more interactive and make it more engaging. And I'll say to them, all right, where can we cut? What changes can we make to your lecture or to your class discussions to make them more active? And they'll say, well, I don't have any room to cut. It's like, well, what's our interactivity pattern? If it's lecture and then a discussion at the end, how can we break that up? How can we go from something where it's very teacher-centered to something that's more student-centered, and thinking about, you might be in a class where you have 20 minutes at the end of class that you can devote to an active learning session. You might have something like this graph on the PowerPoint here about, collaboration and active learning. Maybe you do 10 to 12 minutes of lecture and 3 to 4 minutes of an activity that gets students up, get them thinking, get them talking. So how might we break up our class to get students doing more? So thinking about ways that we can really kind of restructure our classroom approaches, because research has found that, for an adult, we can usually take about 15 to 18 minutes of direct instruction. Now, here I am giving a 1-hour lecture to you and saying that you shouldn't do that. And we shouldn't. We should really think about 15 to 18 minutes for adults. For high school students, typically we're 12 to 15 minutes of direct instruction before they just lose interest, right? They start to like lean back, and that's what I think about in my class. As I'm lecturing my students, the moment I see them start to lean back, or today they start to pick up their cell phone, I know I've lost their interest. And so that can be a good way to measure, okay, I can typically hold my students' attention for about 10 minutes, and now I need to switch to something active. And the other part of this too, of thinking about active learning, when we get students involved in activity, how do we make sure that it remains playful? It's something that Jensen talks about. Teaching with the Brain in Mind is Jensen's book. It says, play allows learners to make mistakes without significant consequences, right? So how do we make sure also that our students are able to try things, see the results of that, and get feedback without there being a consequence? You must find the right answer, or you have to do this, but allowing things to be a little more flexible and open. And one of the things to think about too with this, kind of to wrap up sort of this area of the talk, is with this active learning, we really want to shift from the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, and thinking about there's a reason that remembering and understanding are the foundation of learning, right? There are things we just have to remember. We have to remember 2 + 2 = 4, right? We have to understand the basic grammatical structures of a language. But thinking about that, of identifying in your class, sitting down and looking at your syllabi, for the semester, for this course, and saying to yourself, all right, there are things that my students need to remember. There are things they need to understand. I'm just going to lecture that. They're going to take notes, and we're going to have a quiz, because that's what it needs to be done. That's what needs to happen. But how do we think about with using games, stopping and asking yourself, all right, where in my semester syllabi, where in my daily lesson plan is an opportunity for students to create something or to evaluate? And so, we definitely want to look at our sort of course goals and course objectives in thinking about games, and making sure that our course objectives really align with what a game can do. If I want students to repeat something, I'm not going to use a game. But if I want them to evaluate or argue, I want them to assemble or construct or support or select, that kind of higher part of Bloom's taxonomy, those are areas that we can start to introduce a game into the classroom, right? So thinking about that as well, of, okay, I'm prepared to bring games into my class. I'm prepared to make changes to the way I teach to bring this into the classroom. So what do we do from there? And I think the fundamental difference, the thing that we really have to think about with games, is this power of choice. How many people have seen Titanic? There's some spoilers for Titanic, so I hope you've watched it already. If you haven't, ship sinks. Sorry. Hope I didn't spoil it. And I like to bring this up, and this is my favorite example, because if we think about traditional media in the classroom, if we think about movies and we think about books, we think about a play, they don't change. This is something that a researcher, Ian Bogost, talks about, and says, books and movies, theater, television, they're descriptions or depictions of experience, right? If I watch Titanic, every time I watch Titanic, it does not change. The movie stays the same. So I lean back and I watch it, but I don't have participation in it. And that's the way we've always used media, right? This idea of it's one directional, right? The media goes this way. What is different about video games is they let us try new things. They let us try different opportunities. So I get a choice. It's like, what should I do here? I'm going to try this. And suddenly the game changes. So this idea that, with video games, it's bi-directional is profoundly important because it changes the nature of what's happening. So instead of just being talked at with a book or a movie, I'm being talked with in a video game. So, in the example of Titanic, what if every time I play Titanic, I could make a choice? I could play the video game Titanic, and at the end, Jack and Rose are on the raft, and I just say, Jack, I don't think there's room for you on the raft. And then, I turn to my friend Artom and say, what did you do? Because of course I let Jack on the raft. Why wouldn't I? And we asked Natasha, and she says, no, I wanted to talk to Jack about a few things beforehand. That's the interactivity that's really important about games, where I make a choice and you make a choice, and we can compare those choices together. What did you do? And what did you do? That's really kind of the magic there. And this is something that educators have known for a long time. John Dewey, way back in 1916, talks about we can't have thinking and experience separated, right? Thinking and experience have to go together. That's learning. And video games are great at that. I can think about something and make a choice and see what happens with that choice. So our feedback cycle is really small. And that's profoundly important. So how do we give students the opportunity to make those choices and try new things? And so, as part of that, we also know that the ability to make choices and to try new things and to be more active, to be, involved in active learning, results in more retention. This is the learning pyramid, and it roughly says if I attend a lecture, I'm going to remember about 5% of what I heard in the lecture. If I read it, I'll retain 10% over time. But, if I'm able to practice doing something, I can retain 75% of that information. If I teach others to do something, I can retain up to 90% of the information that I have. So, how do we think about games too is, in this case of a pyramid, driving them down the pyramid and saying, practice doing. Games are a chance for my students to practice doing something, practice using the language, or to interact and help with others, to create that participatory experience. So how do we kind of work through some of those ideas and think about these in new ways? And I think as teachers in higher education, this is really where we can, kind of focus. Is our teachers are going to become teachers. And so, the reality is we teach the way we were taught. So at what point do we actively, as a group of educators in higher education, work to break this cycle and get our students to do more? That involves us giving them opportunities to do more in class. And, I won't go into this too much, but, I do want to think about this idea of backward design, in that, we want to ask ourselves, what are our course goals? And what's my final assessment? And again, going back to that idea of Bloom's taxonomy, really thinking carefully about, if my final assessment is a large standardized test. Standardized testing is a big problem, in my opinion, here in the United States, where, there's not a lot of room for creativity in our class because we have to pass standardized tests. But if we have a portfolio kind of final assessment, if we have a, presentation type of final assessment, there's some opportunities where we can use games to engage and games to be creative. So again, thinking about, what are your learning outcomes for a class? What are your lecture homework activities in your class? And then thinking about, where would games fit best? Again, I'll often hear from teachers, well, what game should I use? Like, well, what are your learning outcomes? What is it that you need your students to learn? So again, thinking about just bringing a game into the class and using it, probably not going to be successful. But if we really think carefully about getting students to be more active, what are our learning outcomes? How might our pedagogy change? We can really make that space for games and get them to be successful, right? So, having learning objectives that are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound learning objectives where the game matches really well. You know, I need my students to understand how fact differs from opinion, and then build a argument using only facts. You know, oh, well, I can use the game quandary for that. You know, that's a great match of my learning objective and my game. So, you know, the preparation work to bring this into our class is really important, right? So to get into that, you know, kind of show some examples here and just some ways to think about games. You know, there are lots of different ways that we can use games in the class, you know, and some of them are, you know, commercial off-the-shelf games that are wildly popular. One right now, and your students are probably certainly playing, at least some of them, is Among Us. And, you know, Among Us is what's called a social deduction game. Long story short, you have one or maybe multiple kind of spies in the group. And the group has to determine who's a spy before the spies eliminate everyone, right? And there are lots of games like this. And I think this is really important because if you have technology in the class, if everyone has a cell phone, you could play this game Among Us in class. If technology is an issue in your classroom, there are lots of great card games that have this exact same mechanic. And if you don't have access to the card games, you can play this as a party, a spoken word game. The great part about some of this is with games, the technology is not really the important part, because often you can play the exact same game in non-digital formats. And so thinking about what works best for you and your students is another important part here. But one of the things about, like, with social deduction games, they're a great place to get started. If you're new to games and you don't quite know where to begin, these can be a really great place to start because they involve lots of WH questions. Where was Anna when, you know, Maria disappeared? Oh, I don't know. She was working in the engineering room. She might be the spy, right? There's lots of grammatical structures as students speculate of who is innocent and who's guilty. And so it creates just, again, here's a mystery, solve it. And what's that language that students are going to communicate? So these social deduction games can be a great place to start, where you're just getting students to really practice. And again, it's one of the powerful things about video games is if we guess and we're wrong and we lose, we just start over and we play again. You know, games can be really, you know, failure supportive, I guess, is a way to think about that. You know, when students fail in a game, they'll often want to keep going and try it again. So it just engages them to ask questions and to think and to problem solve and to be very active. You know, there's just one example of just playing a game in a class and letting the language come out and, you know, really starting to play and being very kind of loose with it is one way to think about a game in the class. So another example, this is from a colleague of mine, James York, and he teaches at a university in Japan. And I really like the way that he sets up using games in the class. And I think it's a great example to model. So what James does, he'll use either a video game or he'll use even board games, you know, paper-based board games in his class. But the first thing he'll have students do is they have to read the rules. They have to read how to play a game. So first thing he does is he makes it a reading activity. The second thing he does is then he has students go online to YouTube or to a video website and watch how that game is played. So they'll watch other people play the game. So now they're doing a listening activity. So with part one and part two here, first thing is they're learning how the game gets played. And then he's preparing them for playing the game in class by they list all the words in this case, English, that they have trouble with. That's a new word. What is that word? And they write it down and they'll do a translation. So now they've read the rule book, they've watched how the game is played, and they've identified specific vocabulary that may be new to them. So then he'll have them do all that as homework, and then they play the game in class. So in this case, he'll have them play a card game. So they're going through and they're playing the game in class, but while they play, he's recording their audio. So he has all the students record themselves while they're playing the game. And they're doing this in class, and then when they finish playing the game, he has them transcribe everything that was said during gameplay. Now suddenly they're listening, they're writing down the language, and it becomes a grammar correction activity. So again, here's someone who does like a very much a present, practice, kind of produce approach, and then thinking about what are the students doing before they play the game? What are they doing after they play the game? Which is critically important. Often, game gets brought into class and it's new, it's novel, and we're thinking about what the students are doing during gameplay. Unfortunately, thinking about the cognitive load with a game, if I'm thinking about a game and I'm using another language, that's a lot of information to balance. And I like what James does here, because he basically, when it's time to play the game, they just play the game. And then before they're using the language and after they're using the language. And not enough teachers think about the before and after when using games in the classroom. There's often too much focus on during. But there are opportunities for that. Another way that I think is a really good version of this is games as context. And one of my colleagues here at Ohio University, Aaron Healy, he uses this. There's a game called the Oregon Trail. If you Google it, if you look it up, you'll find it. It's an old game that teaches American history, and you have to go across the Western United States. And it's a great example of what video game designer Sid Meier's calls video games are a series of interesting choices. And this is really what happens is each day you travel in your little wagon there, and you have to make a choice. Do you stop and rest? Do you keep going? Do you hunt for food? Do you buy supplies? So you have to manage, player health, and you have to manage your money, and you have to manage time before winter comes. So what my colleague will do is students are playing Oregon Trail, and each day they write down what they're doing. Day 1, here's what we did. Day 23, we're crossing the Missouri River, the da-da-da-da-da. So as they go through, now they have this little diary that they've created. So it's a little writing activity, a little writing exercise while they play the game. So then when they're done, they can compare their diaries with one another. Oh, what did you do? What did you do? So it becomes a speaking activity after that. So first they wrote, now they're speaking. And then what Aaron does too is he has them visit a historical website. It's a little difficult to see, I'm sorry. But he has them visit a historical website where they read actual diary entries from people who traveled the Oregon Trail, 200 years ago almost. And so here now they've got their little game diary, and they've got real diaries from people, and they can make that connection. Oh, Margaret Frink, 1850 wrote, da-da-da. Hey, we were in the same place, I in the game and her in the real world, and they can compare that to that real scenario. And that's where I think games can also be really kind of interesting, is they present this context, they present a way to understand material. So how do we get our students to expand what they did in the game to experiences other people may be having in the real world? And there's lots of great games out there. If you Google the idea of serious games or transformative games, there's a website, and I'll put it in the chat at the end, don't worry, called Games for Change, where the games are all designed to do this sort of thing, to teach students about someone else's experiences, right? So games aren't just all big, kind of flashy Fortnite type of things. There are a lot of games out there that are very small and very directed at convey an experience that someone else has. A game I mentioned earlier, Quandary. This is another great game for teachers new to using games in the class. And it's, again, a context. It's a science fiction space colony in the far future. So you go to this space colony, and as the captain of the colony, you have to solve problems. In this case, the community's well has been contaminated. The water is unsafe. But one of the colonists, his well is clean, but it's his privately. He built it and paid for it with his own money. does the community take this private well for its own use, or do they leave it alone? So communal versus private property debate. Okay? But some of the colonists have opinions and others have fact, and you have to sort through them by dragging and dropping and saying, okay, this person said a fact and this person said an opinion. A great type of game to go with a graphic organizer. Using graphic organizer worksheets alongside of a game, so that way students are focused on separating some things out. And then once students had the facts listed, okay, these people had facts and these people had opinions. Now I need to make a decision. So as captain of the colony, you have to make the decision about what is best for your colony, right? So suddenly we have a little debate scenario. If students all play this game, and then you can divide the class and say, okay, who chose this solution? Who chose this solution? All right, as a group, you've got 20 minutes to prepare your argument, and then we're gonna have a class debate. So again, it provides students, they can all make their choices, all have that experience, take their notes in a graphic organizer, and then it becomes a class debate activity. So, this can be another way of providing that structure and thinking about, it's not just what they're doing in the game, but what are they doing after the game? How can they use the information they learned in the class, right? Another great way I see for implementing games in the classroom is a raft activity. I think a raft is a great structure for an activity, because basically you give students a role, you have them address a particular audience in a particular format about a given topic. And I've used in the past, I've used this type of activity with city building games. There's lots of games out there where you can build a little city, Sim City or things like that, city skylines. So, I'll have my students collaboratively as a group. This is back when I taught an English and language, a writing class, to have them build the city, and then they have to make decisions for the city as a group. And so I would give this activity. I'd say, you're a city council member. You're going to address the rest of the class, the other members of our city government, in a speech about the recycling program that you want. This student wants a recycling program. Other students say it costs too much money. All right, go argue and persuade them. So again, I gave them this game as a collaborative activity, and then they had to debate and make decisions for what was best for the city. Their whole goal was to make the city grow. And guess what? Lots of conflict happened. They disagreed a lot, so they'd have to debate their way through that, right? So those sorts of activities that we can really kind of engage in. And really, it's just a matter of figuring out what works best for you and what works best for your students. And these are just a couple of quick examples of ways that you can just get involved quickly and think about how to structure a game in a way that works to get the students talking, right? That works in a way to get them interacting. I always think that if the students are just sitting at a desk and they're on their phone or on their computer and they're just interacting one-on-one with the game, not a good use of class time and not a good use of a video game in the class. Instead, how do we use that interactivity to get them to, I'm going to interact with the game, but then I'm going to interact with the rest of class. It's that component that is really critical when we bring a game into the classroom. So, with all that in mind, I did want to kind of wrap up as we kind of push towards the end of the talk here to address one area that I hear a lot about, and that's gamification. A lot of teachers will say, what about gamification? I've heard so much about it. And really, there's game-based learning and there's gamification and there's lots of terms get thrown around. But what is gamification and what can I do with it in my class? Really, gamification is this idea of using the mechanics of games in non-game context and bringing, this idea of game kind of gameplay, into the classroom is really popular, but unfortunately it often results in, points, badges, and leaderboards, right? I'm going to give my students badges for completing certain activities, or I'm going to have a leaderboard where they all compete. And, unfortunately, that's often the most common use of gamification, and it can often be the most damaging to our students. Alfie Kohn has a great book called Punished by Rewards. And, they find that when we reward students, when something is already intrinsically motivating, their motivation tends to go down. So if we offer rewards to students when something is already interesting, it can often be more harmful to students than helpful. And typically that's what gamification becomes. It's just a rewarding mechanism. But there are other ways to really think about it. And I think that, one of the reasons that games can be really kind of valuable in class is they provide what Chow in this book, Yu-Kai Chow has a book called Actionable Gamification that's really good. And Chow identifies 8 concepts around games and gamification. We have meaning and accomplishment, empowerment, ownership and social influence, scarcity, unpredictability, and avoidance are kind of the 8. And Chow makes this great case that much of gamification and much of games in classrooms are based on scarcity, unpredictability, and avoidance, right? Ooh, there's this badge and only so many students are going to get that badge. That's scarcity. And a little bit of that is really motivating, just a little bit, but too much of it creates stress and is not great gameplay. So, thinking about when we're bringing games into the classroom, we don't want scarcity and unpredictability and avoidance to dominate what we do with it. Instead, how do we think about, giving students opportunity to create meaning? Hey, you're all going to build this city together and create a little functioning city that is successful. Go for it. That ability to create something new. And again, Jenkins' participatory culture, share that meaningfulness with everyone. Because when we do that, when we engage with a group of people and create meaning, it empowers us, right? And makes us feel accomplished. And so how do we really focus on those areas of it, of, the positive aspects of gaming and gamification by, this is a class activity and, I want my students to feel empowered, which means they really need to be able to try things, risk failure, and see what happens with that failure. So if students don't do well, can they do it again? And can they do it again until they develop mastery and reach that feeling of accomplishment? And for a long time in education, that was really considered, taboo. The idea of student taking a quiz and failing, that's it, we're done. But can we have a student take a quiz, and if they don't do well, can they take the quiz again? Can they take the quiz again until they develop the level that they want? This aspect of games and the ability to try things over and over again until we develop mastery is something I think, education can really use and benefit from. So, if we think about these ideas of, I'm going to bring a game to the classroom, well, why? Well, I want my students to feel some kind of empowerment. I want them to collaborate. What are those social components that are really the important part here? And this is what Purushottam and Thorne talk about in an article in 2009. They say, if we're going to have, kind of games in our class, or we're going to have a gamification element to our class, really think about the failure. Designing what happens when players fail is important as when they win. If students don't do well on our, activity or our assignment or homework, what happens? And maybe that requires shifting from a grade, like a point-based or ABC, type of grading system, to a more rubric grading system, where students can see, measures of their performance and say, hey, you in the speaking component, you only got, 5 out of 10 because you didn't make eye contact or engage your audience. Next time you give a speech, let's try it again and focus on that eye contact. Really measurable things that students can benefit from. How do we permit students to spend a little bit more time on activities they enjoy and a little less time on those they don't? Are there ways to differentiate? Say, okay, I need my student to produce something. Well, could it be a writing assignment or a speaking journal? Can can it be both, or does it just have to be writing? Are there ways to give students a little bit of choice in the way they approach a particular classroom assignment? That can also be kind of a way to think about our class in a more gamified way. And I kind of want to wrap up here with just this quote that I think is really important from Sebastian Dieterding. And he says, games are not fun because they're games, right? We say kids love games because they're games. They really love them because they're well designed. And I think, kind of the takeaway from today is that, games are really well designed. And if we think about our classroom in the same way, making it really student-centered, making it active and well designed, we're going to see better results. So how do we think about our classroom as being a well-designed context for our students to learn in? Now, I say that as somebody who isn't teaching 4 classes this semester and having to grade homework and do laundry and all the other things. As teachers, we're busy, right? But how do we find the time to really sit down and design our class to make it more open and engaging? And that takes practice. One of the things I always like to highlight is there's interesting research out there by Sean Dickers in 2012, who looked at award-winning teachers, and he found that for teachers to try new things and for teachers to try just challenging ideas in the classroom, to try a new approach, it really depended on the other teachers around them and the support they got from their administration. So if I try something and say, hey, I want to try this new idea in class, I'm gonna use games in my class, what do you think, Yulia? And Yulia just goes, my motivation goes down, right? So I like to say, don't go alone. If you're thinking about using games in the class, find a couple other teachers that you can brainstorm with. Create a little community of practice, create a little working group where you can all together try a game so you can support one another. And that's really the way it sticks. That's really the way that we can kind of get that change going. So kind of thinking about, after this talk, who can you work with to try this out? Because it's definitely more fun with a friend, and you'll definitely get better results. And so just kind of keep that in mind and think about it. And I'll just put the references up here really quickly so people can see them. But I can always send this presentation out, and share it. And so Anna wants to distribute it, or if the video is available, you can check out the references. The top one there, Ken Bain's What the Best Teachers Do. Great book. I do recommend that one. And yeah, one last thing is here in the United States and globally, there's an organization called TESOL. It's the biggest English teacher professional organization. I'm sure you've all heard of TESOL. I write a monthly blog for the TESOL website, so you can always check it out, blog.tesol.org, and search for me. And it's a game-based learning blog. So I've got a lot of the things we covered today. If you're looking for more details, Jeff, Among Us is a great game, but how do I teach with it? I've got you covered. Visit the blog. You can find lots of notes and check things out. Each month I have a different area with games-related material that you can introduce in your classroom. So definitely check it out for more details. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at JeffKoon72. If you want to, ask questions or disagree with me, or even come play a game, that'd be kind of fun.